So our next session and our final one of today is Challenges to Realizing the ASEAN Economic Community by 2025. And here to speak about that is Mr. Denis. He is a senior research fellow at the Center on Asia Globalization at NUS. Previously, he was the director of the APEC Policy Support Unit. He also has 2 years at the Asian Development Bank, 7 years as a senior fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. It's a good thing to have. And so he's going to speak to us today about the region going in depth and beyond. I know we've focused a lot on India and China today. And he'll be going beyond that for those of you who have interests that go beyond the big ones. So please join me in welcoming Denis.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. Right, so as Anne mentioned, I used to work in the APEC Policy Support Unit for about 12 years. And I think some of my colleagues from APEC were here yesterday to talk about that. And prior to that, I used to be in ADB and also in ASEAN, and I used to work on ASEAN. So in a way, I'm coming back kind of full circle, looking at issues related to ASEAN from the economic point of view. And from my presentation today, you'll find that some things have changed and some things have not, right? So let's start with my first slide. So the ASEAN Economic Community it's a very bold project. I mean, it started back in the 2003 at the ASEAN Summit in Bali, Indonesia. And the idea was, if you look at the language and the Concord, the second ASEAN agreement on this, they are aiming to integrate all their economies, all 10 member states of ASEAN, and to create basically, essentially an integrated market and production place. And the language there was that they wanted to create kind of a single market with, the word then was free flows, not free movement. The word free movement, which is a very European language, was reflected in the latest ASEAN Economic Community blueprint. But back then, the idea was free movement, which is kind of a safer word, of goods, on services, investments, and skilled labor. So is that realistic? Can they achieve that? We're about two and a half years away from 2025. And what are the key challenges in trying to realize the ASEAN Economic Community by that time? So I think that's mainly the focus of my presentation today. If you look at that blueprint, it has kind of 5 key milestones that it needs to achieve by that time. And if you look at it covers from resilient and people-centric ASEAN, a highly integrated cohesive economy, you're looking at enhanced connectivity, competitive, innovative, a global ASEAN. There are various kinds of initiatives and building blocks that's built around these 5 milestones. So you can see here, so ASEAN is not starting from scratch in terms of economic integration, and there have been building blocks in terms of agreements and initiatives over the last 2 decades. In terms of trade in goods, we got the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, investments, the ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Agreement, or ACIA, and then they also focus on trade in services. And in terms of global ASEAN has many FTAs with its major trading partners, whether it's ASEAN Japan, ASEAN China, and more recently, it's come together, ASEAN plus 5 of its major dialogue partners, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, to form RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It's a big mouthful, right? One of the biggest regional free trade agreements right now. There are also ASEAN, about a number of ASEAN member states are also members of what I call other types of regional trade agreement. One of them is TPP or CPTPP now. So it's, again, another mouthful. It's a comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It used to be TPP before. And APEC, which I'm from. APEC is not a free trade agreement. It's a trade forum or a trade bloc, right? There are also, in terms of facilitating freer movement of skilled labor, skilled people, we have mutual recognition agreements for professional services. I think right now ASEAN has there are about 6 or 7 different types of professional services that they're trying to work on, from nursing, architecture, accounting, I think tourism professionals, and so forth. Those MRAs are actually part of the services ATISA, but I just thought I'd single it out because it covers one of the major pillars in terms of making ASEAN a much more people-centric community. And you can see from this chart here the overlapping memberships of ASEAN member states in many of these agreements. And of course, the most recent, which I don't know whether anyone's talked about it yet, is of course IPEF, which is another kind of partnership agreement, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Of that, I think there are 6. You can see from this chart, there are about 6 ASEAN member states which are members of IPEF. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that, but the focus today for my presentation is on ASEAN. Now, in terms of the blueprint, which is to implement and to try to achieve the ASEAN Economic Community, there was a midterm review that was conducted a few years ago, and it did find that about half of those initiatives, the action plans, have been completed with about a 30-odd% to go. Unluckily, unfortunately, the final year of the midterm review in 2020 coincided with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can imagine, right? Everything went to a standstill, right? The whole world literally stopped working for quite some time. There were border controls, movement restrictions, and I think ASEAN's economy in 2020 contracted like 3.2% for that year. And also global supply chains were disrupted. And I think there was I came in at the last bit of the last session, you were talking a little bit about global supply chain disruptions, right? The other major challenge which I want to talk here is about, which would have an impact on economic integration, is that there's a wide economic development gap among ASEAN member states. It's very much different from the EU. I mean, even in the EU, some of the poor European states were not in that stark difference in terms of whether it's human development indicators or income levels or so forth. But you can see here from Singapore, which is GDP per capita is about 72,000, and these are 2021 statistics, and it's a lot higher now. Compared to, say, Cambodia, Myanmar is about 1,000 plus, all right? So you can see that huge economic development gap, which to me is a major challenge, right? If you don't try to achieve economic convergence over time, then economic integration is not going to benefit everyone. That's the reality, right? And to be honest, it's made worse because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that inequality has widened even further, whether you're looking at digital divide, economic divide, poverty levels have gone up. So the challenge now is that, to me, policymakers really need to take the idea of narrowing the development gap much more seriously today than they did before the pandemic. So here's a kind of a list of some of the key challenges, and I'm happy to talk about it a little longer in the Q&A. Some of the emerging challenges, which are not captured in the current blueprint, probably would need to be reflected in the next one. I mean, over the last couple of years during the pandemic, you've seen an acceleration of the adoption of different kinds of digital technology and AI, of course. Now we've got ChatGPT and other types of AI applications, right? And so that, as I mentioned, has widened that development gap. Some will argue, yeah, it's great. It creates a lot of new jobs, right? But it also does create job displacements, job polarization among those who are in jobs which are repetitive in nature will be out of a job. That's the reality, right? And finding them new jobs is what many countries are trying to do in terms of job reskilling, but it takes time. It's just that the rapid transition to these types of new technologies has been so much faster than before. There's also an acute shortage of skilled labor, which is one of the main pillars of the ASEAN Economic Community. In fact, I ran a webinar just a few months ago that found that one is that mutual recognitions of professional qualifications, the process has been quite slow for different reasons, partly also political. But two, one of our speakers was doing a lot of work on Japanese multinationals operating particularly in Vietnam, and they found that in many ways it's the private sector that's been trying to help to facilitate freer movement of skill, whether it's engineers or technicians across different ASEAN states. So one of the recommendations in the paper I wrote for the Hinrich Foundation is that we should have greater participation of the business community in helping in many of these AEC initiatives, particularly in freer movement of skilled labor and mutual recognition of some different types of qualification. I've talked about the economic divide, which I think is something that needs to be addressed. And the other one, of course, is rising trade protectionism. Yes, we've got all these great trade agreements in place in ASEAN, and tariffs within ASEAN member states are pretty much close to zero, but there's still different types on behind the border barriers, non-tariff measures. And last year, we know that there were some knee-jerk reactions to the pandemic. We saw temporary, of course, export restrictions of chicken from Malaysia. If you live in Malaysia, you know that we're all worried about where's our chicken rice going to come from, right? So we had to source it elsewhere in different countries. Or I think Indonesia, it was temporary, was palm oil, right? For a short period of time. The ASEAN Secretariat, I think, is another very important institution that needs to be looked at in Jakarta. As we try to move towards greater integration, I think there's more resources and there needs to be helped to support I think there are 300 to 400 professionals working in the ASEAN Secretariat to help the member states in terms of the implementation, to monitor the progress made as they move forward. I think that's my last slide. Okay, so and beyond. So some final points, right? An EU-style common market really is not realistic by 2025. And to be honest, I think if you talk to some of the ASEAN officials, it was never in their mind that they're going to create something like a European-style common market. Even a customs union, which is the next level up from a free trade agreement, is not on the table for discussion. Right? Basically, a customs union is to have a common external tariff with the rest of the world, which is what happened in the EU, the European Community. As they move forward, step by step, one of the first things they did was to create a customs union among their member states. So what is more realistic is that if they're able to successfully implement the various types of building blocks, which I showed earlier, then you'll have a much more, I would call it kind of like a free trade area plus, a much more comprehensive free trade agreement, which is through its FTAs, like RCEP, will be better plugged into global value chains. I think it's also important to have much more frequent reviews of the AEC blueprint. Right now, I think they're already working on a new blueprint. It could be for another 10 years or another 15 years. But regardless of 10 or 15 years, I think what's important is to make sure that ideally, on an annual basis, they should review the progress that's been made and maybe to introduce new initiatives. If you talk to some of the ASEAN secretary officials, they'll tell you, well, if you can't achieve the ASEAN Economic Community by 2025, then what happens, right? And they'll tell you it's a journey, right? It's not an end goal, it's a journey. I think it's a very convenient way to change the goalpost, don't you think, right? So I think it's important to say, look, you got to achieve a certain level of integration. Otherwise, there's no point going 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards, right? So try to effectively implement many of these initiatives. If you take a look closely at all these ASEAN agreements, whether it's in trade, in goods, so very comprehensive. In fact, I was surprised when I really looked at these agreements, coming back to this. If you looked at the investment agreement today, their investment agreement has an investor-state dispute mechanism, right? In the past, we were talking about it. We were arguing that, the state needs to be involved. So if there's a dispute on investments, it's investor-state dispute mechanism, ISDS. Should be something that should be put in these agreements. The other thing that I talked about was services. The services should be based on a negative list and not a positive list, because a negative list is much more liberalizing, right? So it means you can liberate everything except for a couple of things, right? So, which they did. If you look at the new trade agreement and services, it's based on a negative. They moved away from a positive. So lots of good things that are in these agreements. The key challenge, as you know, is implementation, right? So how do we help them to implement these these various agreements and initiatives will be quite crucial. I think economic convergence are talked about, and then, there will be future kinds of external shocks. I think my good friend, Stephen Olson, gave a very good talk some time back here on the various kinds of shock waves, or I call them external shocks, right? Whether they could be, another pandemic or natural disaster, who knows, financial crisis, right? So we need to be better prepared, whether in terms of our financial systems or in terms of natural disaster, to have a regional emergency preparedness for natural disasters and pandemics is something that I've talked about. We don't have it. It's only at the national level, right? Otherwise, frankly speaking, if it's going to be business as usual, keep calling it a journey in 2035 or 2040, then this project honestly is going to fail. That's my personal view, right? So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we already have some hands up. Let's go to Anton first.
I'm Anton from the Southeast Asia Globe, based in Cambodia. And I was just wondering, what is the effect of the different types of governance throughout ASEAN on the ability for us to economically integrate? Because for like an EU-style common market, in ASEAN, we're going from democracies to authoritarian groups to communist rule to military-backed governments. So how is that going to impact the ability for AEC to kind of pull through?
Well, I think if you talk to an economist, they say, well, politics doesn't come into it, right? So they say, as long as everybody agree on bringing down the tariffs, regardless of what kind of political systems that you have, then it's fine. But I think, to some extent, I don't think that's entirely true, I think. And there's a strong political economy element, like the development divide, maybe different types of political systems are leading to this kind of situation where we've got this widening inequality. But in ASEAN, we don't discuss these things. It's non-interference is part of the kind of the golden rule in we don't interfere in other member states' domestic affairs, which includes that. So you can, whether you call it a stumbling block or not, if you talk about it, I think it's tough. I mean, I can only talk it from the economic point of view, and as long as everybody agrees on, bringing down their tariffs, opening up their sectors or whatever, then it's fine, right? So that's my answer. It's not quite an answer, but that's the best I can do.
Yep, Anggi from the Conversation Indonesia, and I raised my hand expecting someone else will be asking the same questions Anton already asked it, basically. But we have different kind of openness and type and democracy, and my question will be like, will we really be aiming for an EU-style economic kind of integration with this different kind of because like we can learn from what happened with Greece, for example, like by the end of the day it drags everyone down. So like if we keep I'll say like back at the uni, I'm studying international relations, but we usually have this joke that ASEAN works simply because we only care about the economics and we never care about the politics. But to actually aim for economic integration while having our eyes closed about the situation here, I don't think I think like the best we can achieve is probably like financial inclusion, and that's also probably being hindered by the fact that some countries are not at the same level as the others because their politics are, like closing the door for them to actually develop. So I think like without paying attention to this, ASEAN will remain forever toothless. I think like our economies eventually pay attention to this political economic aspect of it.
Well, ASEAN didn't start off as an economic, as a regional grouping to discuss economic cooperation. It started in the 60s to talk about cooperation, security cooperation, right? Particularly, I mean, most of you are not born then, and I was a kid then. But, it was a period of, I'm Malaysian, a period of confrontasi, right? There was a lot of concerns about dispute, conflict, military conflict. So in many ways, ASEAN was formed to try to find a way for everyone to talk together so that there won't be any wars, right? And till today, we don't have any full-blown wars between any of the states. So it did start off that way. In fact, economic cooperation is a more recent phenomenon. In fact, the word economic integration was a bad word. So you go back 20 years ago, even before the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement after 1992, a lot of documentation, whether it's minister, you put the word integration, they'll cancel it out. Cooperation, right? It's only in 1992, before 1992, that we started to develop the ASEAN Free Trade after that they talked about the word integration, trade integration, economic integration. Then it became a bit more acceptable. So in a way, that's economics comes later. But there's a close link because, if you don't have peace and stability, then your economies can't grow. Your global supply chains will not flourish here. Why are they here, not in Latin America and Africa? Because this is an area that's, one is considered peaceful, business-friendly, open. So there are reasons for that, right? To your right, Greece is an example, right? But I think that's the other argument that why do we have to follow the EU model? Economic integration isn't always about doing that. And our history is different, right? We're all relatively new nation states, not like in Europe, right? So that's why we're going on this path, which is a bit different from there. So I don't think it's just about financial inclusion. If you look at it in terms of trade and tariffs, they have been down. Intra-regional trade, I think some of you will argue, it's only 20%, intra-regional, just among themselves, right? But there's a reason why it's about 20% because they trade with the rest of the world, with major trading partners like China. Because they're all part of that global supply chain, right? So I think this is how I describe it, okay? EU is the role model. It's a gold standard in economic integration. And we are probably a far second, but beyond this, what else is there? Nothing, right? So we're doing quite well in our own way. That's how I see it, right? We're taking a different approach for integration.
Hi, I'm Han Vũ. I'm from Tuổi newspaper, Vietnam. So I just want to ask you about the business ID initiative among ASEAN countries has been discussed recently. So any prospect on that initiative, and in that regards, is there any other initiative that we should look forward to in the near terms? Because when talking about ASEAN country, well, we do share like a lot of diversities, and so what can be the DNA that defines us as regions that working together? Thank you.
Right. I haven't been following in too much detail about business ID, but one other initiative which to help business professionals is to have what APEC has. I don't know whether they talked about it yesterday, is APEC Business Travel Card. Yes, we can travel freely without a visa in most ASEAN countries, but that's as a tourist, not as a business professional. You still need a visa for many countries. So whether we can get an ASEAN Business Travel Card will be something I thought would be quite useful. And going beyond that, because in APEC we were talking about during the pandemic inputting our health declaration as well as part of that card, so that if you want to recognize different types of vaccination, all you can do is show the card, they can scan it, and then they'll know whether you've been vaccinated and with what, So that's one area. Having a common identity, some common DNA, I think it's not easy. Even today, they're still trying to talk about an ASEAN identity. And what is it? I'm not also very clear, right? But I tell you one thing that might help, which I don't see in many of the airports. When you go to immigration, there's very few countries that have ASEAN lane. You go to the EU. I just came back from Austria, okay? In Austria, they have an EU lane. You don't have, and they'll just do a scan. They just scan their passport. Everybody else, I think, have to go through immigration. So I don't see why we can't have an ASEAN lane for all ASEAN member states. I only see it in one or two, and then sometimes it disappears. I think Thailand at one time had it, and then I don't see it anymore, right? The other thing is, again, it's more to do with, I think tariffs have gone down, but I believe there's still barriers in place. For example, my second home is the Philippines because my wife is from the Philippines, right? Best coffee, one of the best, other than Vietnam and Indonesia. Wow, so many countries, but Philippines has very good coffee, different kind. They use Braco coffee, right? And I don't see it. Do you see it in the supermarket here? I don't see it, right? I don't see enough of goods from us, different ASEAN states here, right? And why is that? So again, you know, is it to do with taste? I prefer to drink coffee that's from Italy rather than from Indonesia or from Vietnam. I don't know, but I don't see it, or I see very few of those products. So maybe something that can be done. There are three pillars in ASEAN. There's the cultural, social cultural, there's the economic and the political. So maybe on the social cultural side, they need to do more to try to create a much more common identity. But honestly, it takes a long time. Yeah. And you ask a European, is there an EU identity? I don't think so. But just that they have the benefits of borderless, you know, I went from Austria to Czech Republic, no border. I was just so shocked, you know. So it's borderless, and I think for them, comes to mutual recognition again. For them, I think it's called horizontal mutual recognition. It means that I can work, you know, if I'm Austrian, I can work in Germany. I don't need a work permit. I can just, you know, go there. Whereas here, you know, there's a lot of restrictions, you know, and also what qualifications you have. Okay, yeah, we have MRA for nursing, but where do you go to study your nursing? How many years is your nursing education? So forth. Again, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of some level of harmonization of different kinds of standards.
Hi, Dylan from Nikkei Asia. I fully agree with your assessment that the integration project will probably be fruitless or is leading towards a path of fruitlessness. And as much as I agree with my peers over here that politics is an issue in ASEAN integration, I don't believe that economics functions in a vacuum and that politics strongly influences the economic dimension of integration. And this was actually the subject of a very badly written 15,000-word thesis I did for my master's dissertation a few years ago on economic integration in this region. And one of the central arguments that I put forth was that essentially there's no mechanism for supranationalism in Southeast Asia. In the same way that in the EU, you have an EU Commission. And why is there no mechanism for supranationalism? Because there's no political will from each of the individual governments to surrender sovereignty to a supranational body. And that's the core challenge that is at the foundation of all the problems that we're facing with regards to the ASEAN way of doing things. You know, no coercion, lots of dialogue. You have a talk shop, people coming together. I was just in Labuan Bajo 2 months ago for the ASEAN Summit, and they are talking about a 20-year post-2025 vision.
So 20 years,
it's
not
20
10
years.
Okay.
Yeah, it's 20 years. And I was
Too
laughing
long.
because they can't even do this thing properly, and they want to look 20 years ahead. But I suppose, you know, part of the whole essence of this is to get people together to talk better than no talk. Is the gist of it, and you know, better to have a common project to work on, even if it's just optics, than to delve into conflict at the end of the day if there's no talk at all. So, you know, in your view, what do you think is the realistic and pragmatic way that all these objectives that have been set here can be achieved if there is, at the end of the day, no supranational mechanism for countries to be able to surrender their decision making to a central body? And all the different countries in the region, you know, of course, in their domestic and national interests, want to hold on to the power to decide based on their national policy whether they want to participate in a regional economic integration project, and to what extent as well, for that matter.
Okay, it's similar to, my answer is similar to yours as well, because there is economic integration going on, but it's not the European type of integration. So these various agreements that are there are legally binding, whether it's the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, they're legally binding. They have to change domestic legislation to comply. with these things. It's just that I don't see it becoming like the EU with all these it's never going to happen. I just don't think they're going to be. And maybe because we didn't come from that kind of history. They had a very different history from us, right? So to me, as long as you can, it's more to do with implementing what we have, right? I told you, we've got all these different kinds of agreements. We also have mutual recognition, implement it correctly. The other big issue is the development divide. So there is an initiative for ASEAN integration, IAI, right, which is meant to be narrowing the development divide among its member states. And it's been around for about 20 years, and to be honest, it's not effective. And if you go through and look at what initiatives they have, a lot of it is not terribly relevant. I mean, a lot of it is on language training, okay, it's good to learn English, but I think what they need now is things like digital, learning digital literacy, financial literacy. But beyond that, even going beyond that, so I don't think they're taking it too seriously, or they don't have the resources. I don't know what it is, but the actual initiative is not working. So you got these very different agreements. Why don't we focus on what we have? They're very good on paper. Let's implement them properly. And with that, you already have some level of integration.
As a Filipino, I completely agree with your assessment that our coffee is better than Vietnam. Thank you for that. And then I also wanted to share, in Phnom Penh, the ASEAN lane can be flip sign. So the back half is all passports. They just flip the sign depending on where the plane landed from. But being a relatively small economy, I wanted to ask you what you felt the impact of Timor-Leste potentially joining ASEAN would be on all the economic integration.
Okay. This is my personal view, okay? I know that Timor-Leste joining is political in nature, but it does make economic convergence even harder, right? You can see from my chart, right? Just the division between ASEAN 6 and the 4. Actually, you should take Vietnam out, because in fact, if you look at income per capita, Vietnam is almost on par with the Philippines now, right? But even if we don't take them out, you can see that there's a big divide, and I think if you include them, it's even going to get worse. And I can share with you my experience in APEC, which is also very diverse. You've got very rich, developed member states, Australia, US. You also have very poor ones, like Papua New Guinea. And sometimes the frequency is not right. So you listen to them talking. So the Americans will be talking about market access, open your markets, right? And then the developing countries are looking at what? Capacity building, right? So ultimately they will try to find a way to come to the middle, basically saying, well, open our markets, but we need capacity building first. So I think it's very challenging. I mean, it's not up to me, but I think it's going to make that divide worse to include them. So I would stick with. I mean, ideally, if I had it my way, we'd stick to what we have. We've got enough challenges as we are with the existing 10.
Manas.
This is Manas Pratimbuyan from PTI Press Trust of India. It's news agency in India. So my question is about India-ASEAN relations. ASEAN, I think, still one of the most vibrant and dynamic regions globally for growth. And I think your growth story has been quite impressive in the last 15 years. And the overall relations between India and ASEAN, we have seen a significant upswing, particularly after signing of the FTA, both in goods and services. And I think bilateral trade volume reached around 100 billion in around 2019. But I was in Thailand, and when India pulled out of RCEP at the East Asia Summit, ASEAN Summit in Thailand, 2019, there were angry reactions from a number of ASEAN countries. Actually, diplomats were very, very angry that India pulled out of it. And now we are in the process of reviewing our FTA. So how do you see, in fact, what will be the focus areas of review of the FTA between ASEAN and India? So, I mean, trade has witnessed a lot of diversification in the last few years. I think we are now trading more in non-oil and non-energy sectors. So, what according to you would be the focus areas for review of the FTA? And second question is, in fact, I mean, Indo-Pacific has become a very significant area of geopolitical competition, big power competition. And I think ASEAN's growth is also linked to peace and stability in Indo-Pacific. So do you think the region can register a more aggressive growth if there is peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific? And in that context, how do you see ASEAN's overall approach? Because India also has been maintaining that ASEAN centrality is important for Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Okay, there's a lot of questions in there. Okay, let me try to answer them. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a trade negotiator, but I do talk to some of the trade negotiators, whether from Singapore or from some of the others, and I think it was kind of a painful exercise. And when they pulled out, I think a lot of them were very unhappy. So, having said that, if they're renegotiating the ASEAN-India FTA, maybe they need to look at what's happening right now, right? In many ways, India has been growing at quite a rapid pace. Its manufacturing sector is expanding. So, extending many different types of global value chains, not just to China, but to India, is probably the future. Huh? So that's some of the areas also. What do you need to do in terms of these trade agreements to facilitate that will be quite a thing. Movement of preferred skilled labor is another one, right? Whether it's in services sector, IT sector. Again, that would help benefit a lot if there was more mutual cooperation between ASEAN and India. I'm sorry, what are some of the other points that you brought up? There are quite a few, actually.
Use the mic, please.
Indo-Pacific, okay. So, yeah, in APEC last year, there are a lot of questions that came up about IP. Let's talk about IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was launched last year in May, right? What is it? That's the question. What is it, right? And for ASEAN, they're not sure too, but they don't want to be out of it either because we don't know how it's going to play out. I know they've just signed a supply chain agreement, which is in a way not bad, right? There are 4 pillars to IPEF, right? And many of the initiatives that are being discussed, don't tell my colleagues from APEC that are stuck, are being discussed at IPEF, right? Including things like digital trade, things like that. So it's another avenue for different major economies to come together to move forward in this very difficult period of time. Because I can tell you, whether it's at WTO, at APEC, G20, there are a lot of initiatives for geopolitical reasons are stuck. Okay, so if there are initiatives like IPEF where you can bring like-minded people together to move forward on different initiatives like digital trade, I'm all for it, right? And I think for ASEAN, they don't want to be left out, right? They don't know, we're not sure where we stand. I think there was a discussion on US-China rivalry. So where is ASEAN? They don't want to lose out, right? So I think you got to remember, even though we export a lot of our parts and components and different kinds of exports to China, the US is still a major investor in ASEAN. If you look at a long history of investments by US. So they want to be friends with both, right? So I think that's why you see, I think 6 ASEAN member states have signed up to IPEF, right? So let's see what happens. I mean, I can't tell right now. I mean, it could be, IPEF could turn out to be a new form of economic partnership, yeah, as mentioned, or it could be a big nothing. I don't know. We'll have to wait for the next couple of years to see. But the fact that they can sign a supply chain agreement, it's not bad. I mean, something there. There's no market access at this point in time. It's not a free trade agreement, as you know.
Can I ask a non-trade question, in fact? I mean, do you think ASEAN is being able to handle the Myanmar question adequately? Because there are a lot of question marks.
I think you've been following the news. Have they been doing well? Okay, again, it's my personal view, but I think ASEAN centrality, you talked about ASEAN centrality, has been severely undermined by the Myanmar crisis, right? So you want to admit new members when you can't even deal with one of your own existing members, right? So you can see the lack of cohesiveness. And I think the defense ministers met recently. I don't know whether I haven't been following. Have they signed a joint statement for a while? For a while, I think they couldn't even come up with a joint statement, right? Even though that's political, it has implications on economic cooperation for sure. Yeah, there's a strong political economy element to this.
Hi, I'm Lisa from the Wall Street
Hi,
Journal.
Lisa.
Just a follow-up to Manash's question. How is ASEAN planning to deal with Myanmar? And how has the strategy changed over the last kind of 2 or 3 years?
That's a tough question. It's maybe not for me to answer, but they have a 5-point plan, right, which they have not implemented. And I think I think there's a strong sense that the host needs to do something to push that forward. If not, maybe they should really consider suspension of membership. But if you look at the ASEAN Charter, there's no mechanism for suspension at the moment. But to me, if they don't want to, I mean, they said they're going to follow, they didn't do it. So what else okay, you don't invite them for the meetings. Okay, but is that enough? So I think that there needs to be quite strong leadership and political by the host, or ASEAN chair, to try to do something and push forward. If not, maybe they should sit down. That's my view. Please don't. I think they may need to consider suspension. Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you stand?
Oh yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, just a little comment on that. I think like suspension is again like probably crossing that sacred principle of that non-interference, right? But I don't want to like ask about this question, like putting political aspect aside. I really want to know your own personal view, your optimism about ASEAN economic community itself. Do you think?
Okay.
So, and also like you are talking, you keep mentioning about that we can have our own style. What do you have in mind? Do you like probably seeing, probably strengthening our traits? So like Anton will know how Flores Bajawa coffee tastes, or maybe like strengthening our value chain, global value chain, so we can like probably stand, considered as a collectively considered as a, strong economic power. What do you have in mind, and how do we make people, at least, common people, the public, can feel that ASEAN identity as an integrated economy?
If you go back to the original document, ASEAN Concord 2, you'll see that one of the ideas of what they want to achieve in the AEC is a single market and production base, right? And I see the idea of single market not in the sense of a European market, but single market in the sense that your tariffs have gone down, it's easy, rules of origin is very simple, which it is. It's based on a 40% rule. And integrated production base, which I think is, so if you look at these agreements, even investment agreement, the way it works is that you're trying to facilitate global value chains, but you're also trying to encourage ASEAN companies to invest in the region as well. Because if you look at the investment agreement, for example, there's national treatment. That means if I'm a Vietnamese company and I want to open, say, a clothing shop or a factory of some kind in Malaysia or Philippines, right? I should be granted the same treatment, national treatment, as if I'm a local company. Now, I think in practice it's not so easy. I think from what I can I hear, it's not that easy, and all kinds of different kinds of barriers. So, like I said, for some things like that, what are the current, what needs to be done, which I think I'm sure is being done, is what are the current challenges in each of these kinds of agreements, in goods, in services, in investments. Get that sorted out first, and then you probably have a much more, my view, of an integrated market, not the EU type. But identity, we are going back to the idea of identity. But there is some sense of, after so many years of being part of ASEAN, I noticed that even when you go for these meetings, I worked in an international organization for so long, some of the ASEAN member states do tend to gravitate to each other, Of course, I always gravitate to Filipinos because of my wife, but also Indonesians, because I have a lot of friends who are from Indonesia. And I'm also, orang Malaysia, I'm Malaysian. So again, we speak a common language, right? So in a way, I like to think I'm a bit of an ASEAN citizen, right? I work and live in Singapore for so long. My son is now a Singaporean, but I'm still a Malaysian. My wife is Filipino, So Maybe what we need to have maybe is a bit more intermarriage among our fellow citizens, right? And if you look at the European Union, there is a lot of that, but it took hundreds of years. We've just started. It takes time.
Matt, South China Morning Post. I was kind of going off of that a little bit. I was wondering if there's maybe, if you could talk about additional values within the region, if that plays a role in perhaps hindering or the limits of economic integration versus the European Union. It seems like maybe our values more between nations within the region more fractious, do you think, than in the EU, or do you see them as more equivalent and it's other issues that are maybe putting limits on that?
There is a common thread, I think, in the European Union, particularly among the regional EU states, right? Sense of values, right? And I think it's not the same here, and we know that, right? They have different political systems, different systems here, and so maybe that's something they need to work on. Can we find a common ground in terms of our values? I don't know whether that can happen. Because right now it's a lot easier. If you look at the three pillars, economic community seems the easiest, right? Because we're just talking about kind of a win-win situation. We know that we have all these supply chains. Just bring down your tariffs, create a much more business-friendly environment, and that would happen. But I think there's not enough progress if you look at it in the security community and the social cultural perhaps because of things like identity, but even in the security side, I think it's even more difficult now in trying to create a security community because of things like the situation in Myanmar. I think Myanmar is a test, to my sense. Do you have a common set of values among yourselves and how you deal with a situation like this? I think it's a test, and then let's see whether they will succeed or not, right? But if you ask me today, I don't think there's a common set of values among them, except maybe on the economic side. We all want to make money, right? We want to have economic growth. I'm more pessimistic about the future. You talked about that, whether it's on the AEC or on the global economy. There's just so many, I call them known unknowns, right? We've got the conflict in Ukraine. We have issues like inflation, even though it appears to be a bit more under control. But we also have rising inequality, not just in ASEAN, but around the world, right? And a lot of policymakers seem to like to use the word inclusion, inclusive policies. Well, what are they doing about it, to be honest with you? There's a lot of things going on. And I'm more on the pessimistic side about digital technology. I'm all for it. I love that technology. But I also understand that there are consequences to accelerating the technologies. One of the things we found, for example, during the pandemic was that a lot of women in many developing countries exit the labor market earlier because they have a bigger responsibilities in looking after their children during the pandemic, right? And during that period of time, many of these companies started to adopt, I'll lose my staff, right? So let's see whether I can use this software, which I delayed trying to use. I started to use it. And then they suddenly find, for example, they don't have a job anymore once the pandemic is over. Or the kind of skills that I have today are no longer relevant, right? I have a PhD in economics, right? And I had that 30 years ago. If I was applying for a job today, not in a university, I don't think I can get a job. That's my personal view, right? Because the kind of skill set you need today doesn't require you to have a PhD or a master's, right? Or, you don't even have a degree. It's the kind of skills that you want, right? So my son is in HR. He's telling me now that you should change job every 1-2 years. You pick up a skill. You pick a job that has a skill that you don't have, and you pick it up. Because employers today are looking at the kind of skills you have, not whether you have an MBA or PhD or whatever. So the world has changed. And I think even Singapore and many are trying to grapple with the universities and education. How do they change the form of education so that they have the right skills, right? Even the Philippines is an example. I worked in ADB many years ago, and every year I come back, because of the rise in call centers, you see this, you can see it. The economic activities and all these call centers have created a lot of jobs, right? But even that's being replaced. We know that by different kinds of auto robots that, you don't need to call somebody with an American accent anymore because your laptop doesn't work. And on the other side, you're going to hear a robot giving you instructions. So, it's not sustainable, right? And that's the other concern that I have, because many of the ASEAN member states are middle-income countries. So if you don't make the next big leap forward, then you're going to be stuck, in terms of growth. And that leads to social unrest, greater unemployment. So these are things that, many of the countries need to watch out for, right? Sorry, I'm so negative.
Lisa with the Wall Street Journal. You talked a lot about the challenges ASEAN's facing and pushing through policy and initiatives. What is the perception by, with trading partners and diplomats from outside of the region? Do they see ASEAN as very irrelevant? Has this changed over the last few years? How has it changed?
I can give an example, right? If you look at the ASEAN facility for supporting whatever different initiatives from trade to IT, they get loads of money from dialogue partners. Millions and millions. In APAC, we get a fraction of that. I think there are different reasons, and some of them I talked about it here. ASEAN is the only game in town, right? They are probably, they're not as integrated as the EU, but there is some level of, there's a regional entity here, right? And we know that there's a lot of global value chains that's here. And since you guys, a lot of you are political scientists, some people see this ASEAN as also as a counterbalance, right? And I can tell you recently, because I'm now looking after ASEAN in the Lee Kuan Yew School. And so please do check the website. I'm coming up with a number of products to increase awareness to all stakeholders on what ASEAN does, talking to ASEAN practitioners. I'm running a podcast right now. Please watch out for that. Talking to businesses who have navigated various ASEAN policies and what are the challenges that they face. Or talking to people on different aspects of ASEAN related to the ASEAN economic community. And actually there's a hunger for that information, I noticed, particularly in North America and also in Europe. So I think it's partly because on the political side, they see ASEAN maybe as that counterbalance. And two, maybe they see, if they really can get their act together and they are actually integrated, it's a 600 million market, so a potential. Basically US, China, that's the issue, right? So for economic reasons, it's a potential market, let's not ignore it. And two, maybe that's, if things go really bad, can we divert some of our investments? I think you talked about it, some of our investments, supply chains to ASEAN. And particularly if they're much more integrated, then it's even easier. I can set up shop in different parts of ASEAN, depending on which part of the value chain I'm going to be in. Or I want to be in different countries, right?
Final question.
Hello, this is Komel. I'm a freelance journalist based in South Korea. You mentioned about common identity or common interests or values among ASEAN countries that we couldn't find it. But considering your concerns, can we find it in common threats or common enemies or common threats, to unite together?
Okay. Well, in a way, if you talk about it, common economic threat could be one of the reasons. I think one of the reasons why they suddenly decided to have this economic community back in early 2000 was because of this fear. If you remember the term that time was a vacuum cleaner of foreign direct investments going to China, right? Because we are a beneficiary of so much FDI, and there's a close nexus between FDI and trade in Southeast Asia. And suddenly there's this fear, this common threat that, China's opening up and labor is cheaper, so why don't we move a lot of our investments there? So in a way, you could argue that a common threat, it could be one. But now I think there are many common threats. I think it's not just about China. As I mentioned, there are common threats of external shocks or shockwaves is what my good friend Steve also talks about. I think it's all the more important, that's my view, and this also brings up to your point. The problem now we're seeing, and I talked about rising trade protectionism, is that domestic priorities will override regional ones because I need to deal with my own house first, right? We got concerns of rising inequality, increasing poverty. Why do I need to talk about ASEAN, right? I got enough problems in my own house. That's a bit challenging, but at the same time, we need, all the more so, the way I see it, we need to work together. There needs to be better. One of the problems with the pandemic was there wasn't enough global and regional coordination to address the pandemic. And so there are lessons to be learned here that we need to work together, whether it's to set up a regional pandemic preparedness toolkit or setting up different kinds of financial funds if there's a future crisis. We've got the Chiang Mai Initiative, for example, things like that. We need to work together to get ready for future shocks because there will be future shocks. They will be, right? And I think that's something that we need to be prepared for.
That seems like a good note to end on. Thank you so much, Dennis.
Thank you.